Tonight, we revisit one case that became part of British memory. One young life, one investigation, one verdict that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Harriet Louisa Lane begins in Whitechapel, London, in the autumn of 1875. Whitechapel at that time was one of the principal commercial thoroughfares of the East End of London, a district of approximately 150,000 residents situated within the borough of Stepney, east of Aldgate, and running toward Mile End along a road lined with manufacturing workshops, small shops, public houses, and street markets. The neighbourhood was not the extremity of East London poverty documented by journalists and social investigators of the period. It was, rather, a working district of tradespeople, skilled labourers, and small manufacturers. Its streets busy with the movement of goods, and its population mixed in the way of all such thoroughfares that served as arteries between the city and the further reaches of the East End. Brush manufacturers occupied workshops alongside chandlers and clothiers. The Pavilion Theatre, situated near the junction of the road, served a largely working-class audience with popular drama and musical entertainment. The area was, in 1874 and 1875, in a condition of modest economic contraction, the effects of the Panic of 1873 having pressed upon small manufacturers and tradespeople across London and throughout British industry more broadly. It was in this setting, along this road, and in the streets immediately adjacent to it, that the circumstances recorded in this case took shape. Harriet Louisa Lane was baptised at Holy Trinity, Weymouth, Dorset, on the 15th of February, 1852, the daughter of John Lane and Elizabeth Lane, née Evans. Her father was employed as a gas fitter at the Gunpowder Works in Waltham Abbey, Hertfordshire, and the family was resident at Waltham Cross in the same county by the time Harriet reached working age. The precise date of the family's removal from Dorset to Hertfordshire is not documented in surviving records, but the relocation had been completed during Harriet's childhood, and Waltham Cross was the community in which she grew up and entered her working life. Her father's employment placed the household firmly in the working class, his occupation as a gas fitter being a skilled but modestly remunerated trade associated with the industrial works along the Lee Valley. Her mother's maiden name was Evans, and no further detail of the family's domestic circumstances has been established in the surviving record. Harriet's education is not formally documented, but the vocational course her early working life took suggests a basic literacy and an aptitude for fine needlework and dressmaking. She was apprenticed as a milliner and dressmaker to a Mrs. Bray, whose premises were situated opposite the Falcon Inn in Waltham Cross, a position consistent with the employment available to young women of her station and locality in the early 1870s. She subsequently worked in Mrs. Bray's shop at Turner's Hill, Cheshunt, where she continued in the millinery trade. For a period, she assumed the teaching duties of a sister who had recently married, the nature of those duties being consistent with domestic or vocational instruction rather than formal academic teaching. These early years established her in a respectable but precarious working-class orbit, dependent on the needle trades and on the modest household economy of Waltham Cross. Contemporary accounts described her, through the observation of those who knew her during the years that followed, as a woman of pleasing manner and lively disposition, with a noted fondness for dress appropriate to her trade. Those accounts originate largely in testimony given by individuals connected to the man who would kill her, and they should be understood as representations rather than as independent assessments of her character. It was in these years during the early 1870s that Harriet Lane came into contact with Henry Wainwright. The circumstances of their first meeting, as reported in the Times and in local accounts from Hertfordshire, placed the encounter at Broxbourne Gardens, a resort situated on the banks of the River Lea, described in contemporary accounts as a place of respectable character and a favourite recreational ground for Londoners. The Times stated, in its coverage of the subsequent trial, that she was little more than 21 years of age when Wainwright first knew her, and that she was at that time employed as an assistant to a milliner at Waltham Cross, where her parents lived. This account is consistent with the documented chronology of her life. The relationship that followed removed Harriet from Waltham Cross and from the millinery trade entirely, placing her in an arrangement that was to define the remainder of her short life. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now back to the record. Henry Wainwright was born in Whitechapel, East London, in 1832, the son of a brush manufacturer who operated a business along the Whitechapel Road. The family had been engaged in the brush trade across generations, and Henry entered the business as an adult, expanding its operations along the same road where his father had established the original enterprise. The company held a contract to supply brushes to the Metropolitan Police, an arrangement that conferred a degree of commercial respectability on the Wainwright name in the East End. Henry operated a retail premises at 215 Whitechapel Road and a warehouse and workshop at 84 Whitechapel Road, the latter being the working and storage space that served as the site of the crime, in this case. By the census of 1871, he was recorded as a brush maker, employing 103 men, women and boys, and his family was resident at 40 Tredegar Square, Mile End Old Town, an address of modest respectability appropriate to a small manufacturer of his standing. He was married to Elizabeth Fanny Wainwright, née Minshall, whom he had wed at St Dunstan, Stepney, on the 7th of August 1862. They had at least 4 children together. He was, by multiple accounts, a popular figure in the East End community, a frequenter of the Pavilion Theatre adjacent to his premises, a member of a book club, and a participant in debating society activities. He is described in the record as an avid reader, sociable and self-possessed in his public manner. He had no documented criminal history prior to the events of 1874. Henry Wainwright's relationship with Harriet Lane was not his only extramarital association. Secondary sources note connections to women associated with the theatrical world adjacent to his Whitechapel premises. But it was the relationship with Harriet Lane, commencing around 1871, that became sustained and consequential. He installed her in lodgings in the Mile End area, presenting her in the neighbourhood under the fictional identity of Mrs. Percy King, a tradesman's wife. She wore a thick wedding ring consistent with that fiction. She lived under that name, and her 2 daughters by Wainwright were raised within the household she maintained as Mrs. King. The first of those daughters, Beatrice, was born on the 7th of August 1872. The second, Miriam, was born on the 3rd of December 1873. Harriet's circumstances were not hidden from her own family. She had, by contemporary accounts, discussed her situation openly with her parents. She had no legal standing as Wainwright's wife, no claim upon him enforceable at law, and no independent income. Her position was entirely dependent on the continuation of his provision. The financial foundations of that provision had begun to erode well before 1874. From approximately 1872 onwards, the Wainwright brush manufacturing business deteriorated under the compounded pressure of maintaining 2 separate households and the broader economic contraction that followed the panic of 1873. That international financial crisis had severe effects on British manufacturing and trade through the mid-1870s, pressing on small East End manufacturers in particular. Wainwright's business was formally declared bankrupt in 1874. The weekly allowance he had been paying Harriet, understood to have been in the region of £4 to £5, had been reduced as his debts accumulated. She had been moved from earlier lodgings to less expensive accommodation at Sydney Square off the Mile End Road in the period of late 1873 and into 1874, the reduction in her circumstances being a direct reflection of his declining financial position. By the summer of 1874, Harriet Lane's situation had become acutely precarious. She had 2 young children, no legal standing, no independent income, and was entirely dependent on a man whose business was in collapse and whose ability to sustain her in any form had reached its limit. The record indicates that she had, in this period, begun to drink more heavily than she had previously, and that she had made repeated demands upon Wainwright for money, threatening on at least one occasion to expose the affair to his legitimate wife. Witnesses employed at the warehouse reported she had importuned him publicly near his premises. These characterizations originate in testimony produced by individuals connected to Wainwright, and they should be read accordingly, as accounts shaped by the perspective of those who produced them rather than as disinterested observations. What the record establishes clearly is that the situation had become untenable for Wainwright, and that Harriet, having no other recourse, was exercising the only pressure available to her. Wainwright had made at least one attempt to resolve the situation by other means. He enlisted his brother, Thomas George Wainwright, in a stratagem intended to transfer Harriet's attachment to a third party. Thomas Wainwright wrote letters to Harriet under the pseudonym Edward Freak, apparently in the hope that she might be persuaded to accept the protection of this fictitious gentleman and remove herself from Wainwright's orbit. The stratagem did not succeed. Harriet remained at Sydney Square with her two daughters, waiting on the continuance of a relationship that had by 1874 become unsustainable on every practical measure. In the first week of September 1874, Wainwright told Harriet Lane that he intended to leave his wife and establish a home with her. He instructed her to meet him the following Friday and told her, as a cover story to be offered to anyone who inquired, that she was going to meet a man named Mr. Freak. On the morning of Friday, the 11th of September 1874, Harriet left her lodgings at Sydney Square. She was dressed in a grey dress fastened with jet buttons, a bonnet and a cape, and she carried her nightclothes wrapped in a parcel. She was seen by an acquaintance at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, to whom she repeated the account of going to meet Mr. Freak. She then proceeded in the direction of Whitechapel. She was not seen alive again. The year of her disappearance concluded without formal enquiry. Wainwright told those who asked after her that she'd gone to Brighton. Shortly after her disappearance, letters arrived, purportedly from a gentleman named Edward Freak, addressed to Harriet's family and acquaintances. These letters, written by Thomas George Wainwright at his brother's direction, stated that Harriet was under Freak's protection and proposed to marry him, on the condition that she sever ties with her family and former circle. Henry Wainwright represented to those who inquired that he had himself received a similar communication from Freaky. The account was accepted. No police report of Harriet Lane's disappearance was filed. No formal missing persons enquiry was opened. Her two daughters remained in the care of a neighbour, identified in the record as Miss Wilmore, for whose services Wainwright paid 25 shillings each week. For 12 months, the matter rested where it stood. The circumstances leading to the discovery of the crime arose not from any investigation, but from the consequences of Wainwright's financial collapse. Having been declared bankrupt, he was required to vacate and dispose of the Whitechapel warehouse at 84 Whitechapel Road. The body he had buried beneath the warehouse floor on or about the 11th of September 1874 had not decomposed as he had apparently intended. The chloride of lime with which he had covered it had exercised a preservative effect on the remains, contrary to his purpose, and the body remained substantially intact after approximately 12 months of burial. On the 11th of September 1875, 1 year to the day after the murder, Wainwright entered the warehouse and disinterred the remains. He dismembered them, wrapped them in 2 large, heavy, cloth-covered parcels, and made arrangements to have the parcels transported from the premises. He approached Alfred Stokes, a former employee in the brush trade who had remained in contact with him, and asked Stokes to hold the parcels while he went to secure a hansom cab. Stokes noticed the extreme weight of the parcels and detected what he described as a disagreeable smell emanating from them. In Wainwright's absence, he opened one of the parcels. He found inside it a human head, an arm, and a hand. He repacked the parcel, assisted in loading both parcels into the cab when Wainwright returned with it, and did not alert Wainwright to his discovery. He then ran after the cab on foot through the streets of Whitechapel. Stokes's account of what followed is documented in the trial record and in the record of the Royal College of Surgeons. He appealed first to 2 police constables whom he encountered in Leadenhall Street. Those officers declined to act on his account, reportedly dismissing him as disordered. He continued to follow the cab on foot until he was able to attract the attention of 2 further police officers in the Borough on the south side of the river. Those officers stopped the cab in Borough High Street, Southwark, at or near the premises of Thomas George Wainwright. Henry Wainwright was apprehended on the spot. Thomas Wainwright was subsequently arrested. A woman named Alice Day, who had been waiting for Henry Wainwright and was present in the cab at the time of the arrest, was detained but not charged. The 2 parcels were removed to St Saviour's Mortuary, Southwark, where the remains were formally received into official custody. The discovery on the 11th of September 1875 confirmed what no inquiry had been made to establish a year before. The question of how Harriet Lane had died and where she had been for the preceding 12 months was now a matter for formal investigation and, in due course, for the court. The investigation was formally opened by the Divisional Police of Southwark and the Divisional Police of Whitechapel, acting in conjunction. Inspector Fox led significant aspects of the inquiry, and the officers engaged traced Wainwright's prior connection to a woman known as Mrs. Percy King at the Mile End address. The history of his relationship with Harriet Lane was established through the testimony of those who had known her, including members of her family, acquaintances from Sydney Square, and persons connected with the Whitechapel warehouse and its immediate neighbourhood. The warehouse at 84 Whitechapel Road was examined by officers acting on the information now available. The gravesite beneath the floor was identified, and the physical evidence of the burial was recorded. Chloride of lime residue was present at the site, consistent with the account of the body's concealment. Henry Wainwright was known to have possessed a small caliber pistol, and evidence of this fact was collected and entered into the record. The black jet buttons recovered from the grave site, and the grave surroundings were identified as consistent with the buttons described by acquaintances as having been on the grey dress Harriet was wearing on the day she departed Sydney Square. Statements were taken from persons who had known Harriet Lane in the period immediately preceding her disappearance. The friend who had seen her on the afternoon of the 11th of September 1874 gave an account of their last encounter and of the cover story Harriet had offered. Evidence was assembled establishing the movements of both Henry and Thomas Wainwright in the relevant period. The letters purportedly from Edward Freake were recovered and examined. They were established to have been written in the hand of Thomas George Wainwright. Alfred Stokes gave a full statement of his discovery and of the actions he had taken upon it, including the initial dismissal he had received from the 2 constables in Leadenhall Street and his subsequent persistence in following the cab to the Borough. His account was detailed and consistent. Miss Wilmore, who had cared for Harriet's 2 daughters during the year of her disappearance, gave evidence of the arrangements Wainwright had made and maintained for the children's upkeep. Members of Harriet's family attended to provide identification evidence, and the process of establishing the identity of the remains was conducted in the weeks following the arrest. The investigation had now extended across both the Southwark and Whitechapel divisions and had produced a substantial body of physical, documentary, and witness evidence. The grave site, the parcels, the letters, the buttons, the pistol evidence, and the testimony of Stokes, Wilmore, and Harriet's family constituted the evidentiary foundation upon which the prosecution would rest its case. Henry Wainwright maintained, in his initial statement following arrest, that he had no knowledge of the contents of the parcels, asserting that he had received them from an unidentified man encountered in a public house. He maintained this position in the formal proceedings that followed. Thomas Wainwright made no claim to have been ignorant of the letters written in the name of Freake. A post-mortem examination was conducted at St Saviour's Mortuary, Southwark. The examining surgeon was Frederick George Larkin, then in his late 20s and subsequently to become one of the more notable forensic practitioners of the Victorian period. Thomas Bond, a surgeon who would later be called upon to provide forensic reports in connection with the Whitechapel murders of 1888, assisted Larkin in the examination of the remains. Both surgeons were present throughout the proceedings, and both gave evidence at the subsequent trial. Lord Chief Justice Cockburn subsequently directed that each surgeon receive a special fee of 5 guineas per day for their attendance at the Old Bailey, expressing the court's recognition of the quality and significance of their evidence. The cause of death was established as 3 gunshot wounds to the head inflicted with a small caliber pistol. The forensic examination of the skull traced the paths of the 3 bullets. The throat had been cut, and Larkin established from the condition of the wound and the surrounding tissue that this incision had been made after the gunshots, not before, the victim having been shot to death before the throat was cut. The age of the deceased was determined in part through examination of the wisdom teeth, the findings being consistent with Harriet Lane's known age at the time of her disappearance. Height and shoe measurements were recorded. The uterus was examined and confirmed the prior bearing of children, a finding that served as a significant element in the identification of the remains, given the documented existence of Harriet's 2 daughters. A distinctive scar below the right knee was noted and subsequently identified by family members as a feature they recognised. The arrangement of the hair, which Larkin described as worn over a velvet pad and secured with numerous hairpins, was consistent with the style known to have been favoured by Harriet Lane. The chloride of lime that had been applied to the remains at the time of burial had, contrary to its intended purpose, exercised a preservative effect that assisted the forensic examination rather than impeding it. The identification of the remains was formally established through a combination of physical examination and family recognition. Facial features were largely unrecognisable after approximately 1 year of burial, but the scar, the hair arrangement, the jewellery recovered from the grave, and the jet buttons matched to the grey dress described by witnesses as worn by Harriet on the 11th of September 1874 were accepted by the court as sufficient to confirm her identity. Her family attended and gave identification evidence based on these combined factors. These findings were entered into the official record and formed the core of the prosecution's physical case. The preliminary proceedings were heard at Southwark Police Court, where Inspector Fox was named in connection with the committal stage. The hearing committed both Henry and Thomas George Wainwright for trial at the Central Criminal Court. The case came before the Old Bailey on the 22nd of November, 1875. The presiding judge was Sir Alexander Cockburn, 12th Baronet, Lord Chief Justice of England, who had held that position since 1859. Crown counsel for the prosecution included John Holker, an eminent barrister who would subsequently serve as Attorney General. The defence of Henry Wainwright was conducted by Besley. Henry Wainwright was charged with the willful murder of Harriet Louisa Lane. Thomas George Wainwright was charged as accessory after the fact to murder. Both entered pleas of not guilty. The prosecution presented its case through a substantial body of evidence assembled during the investigation. Alfred Stokes gave evidence as the principal eyewitness to the discovery and to Henry Wainwright's possession and attempted transportation of the parcels. His account placed Wainwright in direct physical custody of the dismembered remains and established the sequence of events from the moment of discovery through the arrest in Borough High Street. Frederick Larkin gave detailed forensic evidence on the cause of death, the identification of the remains, and the condition of the burial site. Thomas Bond supported Larkin's forensic testimony. Members of Harriet Lane's family gave identification evidence based on the scar, the buttons, and the hair arrangements. Witnesses to Harriet's last known movements testified to seeing her on the afternoon of the 11th of September 1874, dressed in the grey dress with jet buttons, proceeding in the direction of Whitechapel. The letters written in the name of Edward Freake were presented in evidence and established to have been written in the hand of Thomas George Wainwright. Evidence was given of Henry Wainwright's prior possession of a pistol consistent in calibre with the murder weapon. Miss Wilmore gave evidence of the arrangement made for the care of Harriet's 2 daughters following her disappearance. Alice Day, who had been present in the cab at the time of the arrest, testified, the precise content of her testimony not being fully elaborated in sources reviewed beyond the general record of the trial. The defence argued, on behalf of Henry Wainwright, that the remains were too badly decomposed to be positively identified as those of Harriet Lane, and that his possession of the parcels did not establish his knowledge of their contents, he having maintained throughout that he had received them from an unidentified person in a public house. The forensic evidence of Larkin and Bond, taken together with the family identification evidence and the physical correspondence between the remains and the known characteristics of Harriet Lane, defeated the identification argument to the satisfaction of the jury. The public house account was met by Stokes's direct and detailed testimony of what he had observed and heard at the warehouse prior to the cab being summoned. Henry Wainwright conducted himself throughout the trial with a composure that was remarked upon by contemporaries. The Spectator, in its account of the 4th of December, 1875, described him as a man of proud and daring spirit, and observed that remaining at the centre of attention, even as the accused in a capital trial, was probably not displeasing to him. His manner was noted as self-possessed, and on occasion as jaunty. When the Lord Chief Justice's recapitulation of the evidence reached its most damaging passages, Wainwright was recorded as showing some outward sign of agitation, but this was not sustained. His characteristic manner throughout the proceedings was one of deliberate composure. The jury retired to consider its verdict. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict against Henry Wainwright was guilty of wilful murder. The verdict against Thomas George Wainwright was guilty as accessory after the fact to murder. When the verdict was delivered, Henry Wainwright reportedly thanked his counsel with an ease of manner he appeared to consider appropriate to the occasion. He was checked by the judge from making further remarks. He declined throughout the proceedings to acknowledge the identity of the remains, referring to them on one occasion as these remains. The verdict was entered in the court record of the Central Criminal Court, London. The prosecution's case, resting on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and physical identification, had been accepted by the jury in its entirety. The conviction would form the basis for what followed. The court proceeded to sentencing. The sentence upon Henry Wainwright was pronounced by the Lord Chief Justice: death by hanging. The sentence upon Thomas George Wainwright was 7 years penal servitude. No petition for clemency on behalf of Henry Wainwright appears in the surviving record. No challenge to the verdict was raised in the courts or before the Home Secretary. The sentence stood. Henry Wainwright was executed at Newgate Jail, London, on the 21st of December, 1875. Public executions had been abolished in England under the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, and the execution was conducted within the prison precincts before a restricted audience comprising the sheriff, the under-sheriffs, the governor of the jail, the ordinary of Newgate, the Reverend Lloyd Jones, a limited number of press representatives, and a small number of authorised witnesses. The executioner was William Marwood. The Times reported that a large crowd had gathered in the Old Bailey from an early hour on the morning of the execution, though no member of that crowd had any prospect of witnessing the proceedings taking place within the prison walls. Approximately 200 persons are recorded as having been present within the prison as witnesses to the execution. No last words attributed to Henry Wainwright have been established in the surviving record. His characteristic composure was noted up to the conclusion. He was buried within the precincts of Newgate Jail. The remains of Harriet Louisa Lane were, following the conclusion of the post-mortem examination and the trial, properly reburied at Waltham Holy Cross Cemetery, Waltham Abbey, Essex. This is documented in William Winter's Our Parish Registers, published in 1885. Her grave at Waltham Abbey brought her, in death, to the county where she had grown up and from which her life in London had begun. Her father, John Lane, her mother, Elizabeth Lane, and the community of Waltham Cross were in that county. She was 22 years of age when she was killed. Her two daughters, Beatrice, born the 7th of August 1872, and Miriam, born the 3rd of December 1873, had remained throughout the year of concealment and through the period of the trial in the care of Miss Wilmore, supported by the payments Wainwright had arranged. Their father had been executed. Their mother had been murdered. The record does not follow them. Thomas George Wainwright served his term of 7 years penal servitude. No further documented record of his life following his release has been established in the sources reviewed. Elizabeth Fanny Wainwright, Henry's widow, is recorded in genealogical sources as having had brothers who were partners in the Wainwright business. Those brothers subsequently emigrated to Melbourne, Australia, and established a brushmaking enterprise there. Her own subsequent circumstances are not documented in the surviving record. The case attracted, at the time of the trial, coverage of a kind that placed it among the most widely reported criminal proceedings of the decade. The Times carried verbatim accounts of the trial, from its opening day through the verdict and the execution. Regional papers across England reported the case in detail. The contemporary press referred to the proceedings as the Whitechapel tragedy. The Spectator's account of the 4th of December 1875 compared the case's public resonance to that of the Palmer poisoning trial of the 1850s, while judging it to be somewhat less nationally resonant outside of London than Palmer's case had been. The crowds that gathered outside Newgate on the morning of the execution, unable to witness anything and knowing they were unable, testified to the degree of public attention the case had sustained through the months of investigation, trial, and sentencing. An execution broadside titled "Execution and Confession of H. Wainwright" was printed and distributed in the days immediately following his death. A copy of this broadside survives in the collection of the London Museum, and a second copy is held in the British Criminal Broadsides collection at Kent State University Libraries in the United States. The broadside featured woodcut portraits of Wainwright and of Harriet Lane, 2 engravings depicting scenes from the crime, and an image of the gallows. Execution broadsides of this kind continue to be produced and sold as street literature in the years following the abolition of public executions, and the Wainwright case generated at least one significant example of the form. The case was included in the notable British trial series in 1920, when H.B. Irving edited a volume devoted to the proceedings. That edition drew on the formal trial transcript and on contemporary newspaper coverage, and it established the case's place in the canonical literature of Victorian crime. Frederick George Larkin's personal annotated copy of Irving's volume, carrying manuscript editions in Larkin's own hand, survives in the library of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, where it constitutes a primary source document of considerable value for the forensic history of the case. The case received extended treatment in Neil Watson's full-length monograph published in 2023, and has been discussed in Judith Flanders' survey of Victorian crime and press culture, published in 2011. It has continued to appear in surveys of Victorian criminal history and in anthologies of East End crime, its forensic dimensions, its social context, and the singular chain of events leading to its exposure, ensuring that it has not left the record. There is one dimension of the case's cultural persistence that is documented in primary sources, and that attaches to the name of the victim herself. By the last years of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the name Harriet Lane had entered working class and naval slang as a term for Australian tinned meat, specifically corned beef. The association arose from the dismembered and packaged condition of the remains, the appearance of the tinned meat recalling, in the idiom of those who used the phrase, the parcelled contents of the cab that had been stopped in Borough High Street in September of 1875, The usage is documented in James Ware's Passing English of the Victorian Era, published posthumously in 1909, and its naval currency is attested in the Northern Daily Mail and South Durham Herald of the 14th of July 1894 in an article on naval slang. The name of the victim had passed into the language, stripped of its context and transformed, in the way of such things, into something bearing no outward relation to the woman whose disappearance had occasioned it. The forensic significance of the case extends beyond its immediate legal outcome. The post-mortem examination conducted by Frederick Larkin and Thomas Bond at St Saviour's Mortuary in September 1875 represents one of the earlier documented instances of sophisticated forensic pathology being deployed as the primary basis for victim identification in a British murder trial. The examination of skull ballistics to trace the paths of projectiles, the use of dental examination to establish approximate age, the biometric recording of physical measurements, and the examination of the uterus to establish prior maternity were techniques applied here with a precision and evidential weight that impressed the court and were formally recognised by the Lord Chief Justice's award of the special fee to the surgeons. Thomas Bond's subsequent involvement in the forensic examination of victims in the Whitechapel murders of 1888 is a noted connection in the documentary history of Victorian forensic medicine, and the Wainwright case represents an earlier point in his professional record. The social dimensions of the case are as significant as its forensic ones. Harriet Lane lived in a condition of structural invisibility. She had no legal status as a wife. She had no claim enforceable at law against the man who had installed her in false lodgings under a false name. She had no independent income and no occupation. When she disappeared, no formal enquiry followed. The letters attributed to Edward Freake, written by Henry Wainwright's brother at Henry Wainwright's direction, closed the matter before it was opened. Her social position made her disappearance invisible to formal authority. The case was resolved not through any exercise of that authority, but through the chance observation of a former employee who happened to notice the weight and smell of a parcel, and had the persistence to follow a cab through the streets of Southwark on foot after 2 police constables had declined to listen to him. The formal record of the case opened a year after her death, and only because the man who had killed her was required by his bankruptcy to vacate the premises beneath whose floor she lay. The case of Harriet Louisa Lane was the only case examined here. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1875. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.